So what Sanat and I will be covering today includes the following. We'll be covering what is privileged access management exactly, and why is it actually so important? We'll also be covering some common challenges that organizations face when it comes to privileged access management. And then also, which is the main kind of element of this presentation, where would we recommend that you actually start on your privileged access management journey, including some ideas on quick wins. So I'll be passing to Sanat in a few minutes, who will take us through the bulk of the presentation. But what I wanted to cover first is kind of reminding ourselves on why privileged access management is so important. We thought we'd start off with this poll question just to get everybody's thinking caps on, not that it's a difficult question, of course. So the poll question is, what do you think is the percentage of data breaches that involved privileged accounts? And we'll let Sophie bring up the poll functionality. So is it A, less than 20%, B, 20 to 40, C, 41 to 60, D, 61 to 80, or E, above 80%? What does everybody think? I'll just give everyone a few moments. Okay, poll results are in. So most people thought that it was above 80%, and then that was 43% of you, and then 29% of you thought it was 61 to 80%. So mostly correct. The correct answer, according to a Forbes article, was actually around 80%. So those of you who answered D, correct, but it was kind of almost a trick question. So anyone who answered E, is about right as well. For the nerds like me out there, you might be interested in some other stats. So I'll just read some of these out actually. So there was I think 2019 Forbes article, which was a report from a Centrify study, and that stated that about 74% of data breaches started with privileged credentials abuse. And then there's other stats out there. For example, the IDSA found that 79% of organizations have had an identity-related breach within the past 2 years. And then more recently, in this year's Verizon Data Breach Investigations report, that reported that about 61% of breaches involved credentials. So while there's varying stats out there and different studies out there, I think what's clear is that these stats are in the high percentages, and that points to or reconfirms, I guess, what many of us in the security industry know already, which is that having appropriate identity and access management and privileged access management controls is important, and actually growing in importance as well, to help organizations reduce the risk of being breached. And obviously breaches cost money and can have significant reputational damage implications as well. And to give us a sense of how privileged access management plays a part in a breach, let's look at the cyber kill chain for a moment, and also just talk about some breaches that hit the news in the past few years. So the cyber kill chain, it's a cybersecurity model. It was developed by Lockheed Martin, and the objective of that was to help security teams and organizations understand the various stages of an attack. And there's numerous variations of this model out there, but they broadly and roughly follow the same steps. So I'll just walk through the steps as well. First of all, typically, but not always, the first step of an attack is reconnaissance. So this is where the attacker is trying to scope out their target, collect information that might help them with the attack. It could involve port scanning, for example, trying to look at what vulnerabilities are out there, essentially trying to find what ways can they get into your organization. They could even look at social media or the dark web to look for credentials. In the next step, which is intrusion, once the attacker has some intel, they'll try to break in via various methods. This could be delivering malware in a phishing email, for example, or it could be them trying to brute force or guess credentials and passwords. And also phishing attacks are becoming more and more prevalent, especially with the current situation of the pandemic, where many people are working from home as well. The next step, exploitation. So this is where once the attacker is through the front door, so to speak, they'll try to get onto various systems or will try to install additional tools or run scripts. And then in the next one, privileged escalation, the next step, this is where the attacker will most likely try to escalate their privileges. And the more privileges they have, the more damage they can do, or the more stuff they can try and get access to in general. So there's two types of privilege escalation, horizontal and vertical. So with horizontal, this is where the attacker will try to gain access to the resources of a different user that has the same privileges as the account they might already have access to, but the other account may have access to different resources. Versus vertical privilege escalation, and that's where the attacker tries to gain access to more privileges than the account that they already have access to. And typically this is where they'll try to get access to an administrator account. So once the attacker has access to a privileged account, they may try to move laterally, so move across systems. They may try to find sensitive data. They may try to gain access to other accounts, or they may try to reactivate maybe dormant service accounts as an example. And again, obviously, if they've got access to a privileged account or accounts, that allows them to move around the network while hiding in plain sight. They might also try to reduce the risk of being detected by living off the land. So that's where they would use tools that already exist in the environment, for example, PowerShell. And that's where they really try to hide their tracks as well. And the other thing to note here is that I think what's becoming harder and harder these days is that attackers are becoming pretty patient. So they may take their time to move around the network, and sometimes they take weeks or months. And again, this is really to try and reduce the risk of being detected and setting off any alarm bells. And speaking of hiding their tracks, they'll try to conceal their presence and maybe wipe logs or change log data and change timestamps, for example. And again, the longer they can go undetected, the better for them. And then in the last step, which I've got here is denial of service, but really this is where the attackers then try to act on their end objectives, which is either to maybe disrupt the business, or they might cause a denial of service attack as a way of distracting from their real objective, which might be to exfiltrate data, as an example. And it might be to encrypt data and hold it to ransom. So let's look at some recent hacks and breaches. There's probably too many to kind of go through, so I've just got two examples there. The first one is SolarWinds, which many of you would have heard of, I'm sure. This, of course, was classified as a nation-state supply chain attack, where malicious code was snuck into SolarWinds' popular IT management and monitoring software called Orion. And then that made its way to SolarWinds companies that use Orion via this Trojanized software update. I think it was reported that SolarWinds has had about 33,000 customers that use Orion, and of those, about 18,000 actually downloaded the hacked software. And this actually included government agencies and high-profile tech companies as well, even Microsoft. So this hacked code essentially created a backdoor to their customers' networks, which the attackers then used to breach these customers' networks, and again, likely following the stages or some of the stages in the cyber kill chain that I just went through. And then I think also what was quite damaging is that Orion, due to the very nature of the Orion software, it's connected to all sorts of devices and infrastructure across customers' networks, because that's what it does in terms of network and network management. And all those connections, of course, rely on credentials. And typically, of course, these are privileged credentials. So the attackers were then able to, again, using the cyber kill chain steps there, were then able to move laterally and escalate their privileges on customers' networks. And I think there were even reports of admin accounts being breached and being used to do things like add Active Directory tenants, putting in a trust in place there, and then the attackers had continued access to the customer's network through that new trusted tenant. And the actual impacts of this SolarWinds breach is probably not fully known at this point in time, but there are reports of IP, source code being stolen, etc. So it's obviously quite a damaging attack. And the second one, just to quickly go through that there, I guess it's quite an old one. It's an oldie but a goodie. So in 2018, I think it was, the Marriott hotel chain did announce that one of its reservation systems had been breached. And then I think it was later reported as well that they found out that the attack had gone undetected for 4 years. Again, looking at the cyber attack kill chain, there were a series of factors and events that led to poor security and that led to the breach. And it was reported that the attacker used tools to sniff out username and password combinations. Again, they tried to get a hold or successfully got a hold of administrator credentials to the reservation system database. They were able to run database queries and then eventually encrypt and exfiltrate the data. And then in 2020, which is the news article screenshot there, the ICO actually fined the Marriott hotel chain for £18.4 million because this was a major data breach that affected, I hope I get this number correct, but 339 million guests. So quite a wide impact there. So these attacks, again, they're just two of many examples, but these attacks show the importance of maintaining an entire ecosystem of cybersecurity controls in order to try and detect, deny, disrupt, degrade, and deceive attackers. And today we'll be focusing on only one control of this ecosystem of controls that organizations need to maintain. And of course, we'll be focusing on privileged access management. And when by no means saying that privileged access management is a magic silver bullet that would have prevented these attacks. We're not saying that at all, but I guess, strong privileged access management could have helped detect or deny or disrupt some of the attacks or some part of the kill chain. It could have potentially reduced the risk of credential theft in the first place. It could have reduced the risk of lateral movement happening. And of course, it could have limited the ability for the attacker to perform privileged escalation. So I think I'll now pass over to Sunit, who will take us through how to approach privileged access management. It is a topic that many organizations consider a challenging and complex topic. Thank you, Sunit.
Thanks, Sarah. So what I'd like to do is kind of picking up on what Sarah was talking about in relation to the cyber kill chain, is effectively look at exactly what privileged access is. Now, with privileged access, there are so many definitions of it about, and I'm not saying that any of them are incorrect, but they all have an interpretation of their own. The themes are typically the same, where we talk about things like administrative access or godlike access, or designated as special rights. But effectively, one of the things that I really wanted to do is show that this is actually a relatively confusing field to embark upon, especially if you're looking at it for the first time. With so many different definitions, what I wanted to first do was actually try to simplify the concept of what privileged access actually is. So let me try to take this back down to what the basics of actually granting access to a system. So what that effectively looks like is, in order to gain access or be granted access to a system, you're typically given an access type or a permission, and that is usually applied to an account. Now, let's just take a quick look at that for a second. So first of all, we want to look at exactly what an account is. So there's varying types of accounts. You could have an individual's account, or you could even have a generic account. So an individual's account could be someone is very unique to the person that it's been given to. So say, for example, I walk into an organization, I am given an individual account, which only I should know the user, the credentials of. And then you can also have a generic account. So with a generic account, there are various types, but the concept is that it's not attributed back to an individual. So you could have a technical or service account, and that technical or service account could be typically used for system-to-system communication. Or you could have a shared account. Now, an example of that could be a test account, which is being used by multiple by multiple people. Or you could have a built-in or assistant account, and that's basically if you have a system or an application or a technology, there are certain accounts that come with that platform, which cannot be removed, and they're effectively come with the platform. So within the concept, within what I'm effectively trying to describe, is that these are nothing but just objects. These are objects that you apply permissions to. So let's effectively then take a quick look at what permissions are, and hopefully you'll start seeing why this is so important in a second. So when it comes to access, you can have different types of access. You can have different types of access types and permissions. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but effectively we want to be looking at the three types of categories of access. So the first is access entitlements or rights. So that's very much the kind of lower level types of permissions that could be disseminated. So things like read, write, execute, those types of functions. then you may have access levels. Now, this could be a combination of all the access entitlements for various resources. And they're effectively merged together in order for certain people to do so, in order for certain functionalities to come together. And then finally, you could have access roles, which is effectively another combination of access groups and levels. So I think one of the things that I'm trying to get across here is one of the most important parts is that there are varying ways in which you can talk about permissions, rights, entitlements. There's so many different types of ways of describing permissions, but ultimately the concept is these are the permissions that are being granted in order for you to do a particular function. Now, as part of that, the definition of privilege, now coming back to the kind of the main topic here, the idea here is that even though all of these allow certain functionalities, that definition of what privileged access is constitutes what you believe to be important in relation to your organization and your industry. And it's incredibly important to understand that you have to mark that not all access types or access permissions are going to be privileged, but let's say they are. Let's say, for example, you go through a process where you've taken your access type, you've taken an account and you've given it an access or a permission, and then through your process, through your organization, you are effectively going to be defining if that privilege that has been granted is considered privileged, and then at that point, then the account itself becomes a privileged account, and that's what you're looking at effectively controlling. So let me use a little bit more of a contextual example in this. So let's say, for example, you have John Smith. Now, John Smith's a member of the Windows team, and he's been given an individual or a user account, and we call that John.Smith. Now, we then make John Smith a member of a domain admin group within our Active Directory. Now, at this point, we've not actually, we've granted John the permission, but it is up to us to say whether or not that group, the domain admin group, is actually a privileged group. But in this context, we're actually saying that it is. So as a result, this account that John has now becomes a privileged account. And in essence, when we're talking about privileged access, that's effectively what we're talking about. That then we can start using the definitions that are provided by various institutions and frameworks and standards, and we can see how that applies within the general concept of granting access and the accesses that are granted. So what I'd like to start off with is, now that I've kind of tried to get everybody on the same playing field when it comes to understanding what privileged access is, if you were looking at managing privileged access, where would you start? And this is just to give us an idea of where people think a good place to start is. So the first would be writing a privileged access information security policy. The second could be implementing a PAM solution. Or the third is understanding your current privileged access management state. So I'll give you guys some time to answer that question. Okay, so the results are in, and everybody on the call or everybody on the presentation is saying that understanding your privileged access management state is the most important thing to start with. Really good. Okay, so one of the things that I find quite interesting is through the conversations and interactions that I have with various organizations and my experiences in general, we find that organizations tend to jump straight to the solution. They say, okay, right, we need a PAM solution. We should go ahead and implement one straight away. What I'd like to do is just explore the reasoning why you shouldn't do so. But here's a couple of reasons. Here's to begin with, let's just explore why this is a general theme. So you may have external auditors within your organization, or you may have even your internal risk teams saying that that privileged access within the organization must be controlled, and we need a PAM solution in order to do so. You could have systems administrators, or even your organization's your security officer saying that, again, we need to control privileged access, and we need a solution in order to do so. Or you may come across published statistics, similar to what Sarah was mentioning earlier, whereby circa 80% of all cyber attacks have or utilize some form of privileged access as part of their attack chain. But the question here is, why shouldn't we jump straight to the solution? Well, the answer there is effectively we don't know the size of the problem, and it's really important to understand the size of the problem before you start going ahead and trying to solutionize and implement a solution. The reason why understanding the problem is so important is because you're not quite sure at this point what the capabilities or the controls that you require are, and more importantly, how they should effectively operate. The other aspect is you don't know how big the PAM solution itself actually needs to be. So, for example, if you're designing something and trying to figure out how to effectively size the solution itself, then if you don't know how big the problem is, how big the solution should be needs to be understood. Onboarding new accounts and the order by which they should actually even be done. Again, if you don't know how many privileged accounts you have within your IT estate, within your systems, within your applications, then it's going to be incredibly difficult to understand, again, how big the solution should be, and if it is the right answer to the problem itself. So hopefully at this point you're starting to get an idea of why it's important to get an understanding of how big the actual problem is. So one of the a fair few common challenges that we have by going with this kind of solution-led approach is organizations don't necessarily know where to start. So then at that point, what they do is they go, right, we're gonna buy this solution, but once you've done that, increasing the maturity of that solution and allowing you to go through a process of actually improving privileged access within your the management of privileged access within your organization becomes incredibly daunting. So really not knowing how to navigate through that whole process is quite a common challenge. In addition to that, there's often no necessarily frameworks or operational management model that's effectively put in place, and becomes incredibly difficult for the organization as a whole in order to manage the solution and understand how best to deploy its capabilities once it has been implemented. Now, the other aspect is then once you have implemented, or let's say you've set up a PAM project to deploy a solution, other technologies that haven't necessarily been addressed as part of the initial PAM project don't find themselves having a way of which to actually utilize the new capabilities that have been onboarded. So it's been applied to the systems that have, but not necessarily to new ones that are coming through. Now, one of the more common aspects that I've seen a lot of is the operational management of a PAM solution, and the fact that the BAU management, the business as usual management of the team, the process of which isn't necessarily considered, and the cost, the effort to onboard new systems, new accounts, new privileges, new privileged accounts becomes even more difficult. So especially when existing teams actually have other responsibilities that they need to take care of. Overall, another common challenge is that there's a bit of pushback in relation to the systems that are being onboarded. So if, for example, the solution isn't necessarily working in the most efficient way possible, or isn't necessarily incorporated or into the wider organization's IT infrastructure and ecosystem, then there tends to be a growing frustration, especially within operational teams, of the usage of a PAM solution, because it doesn't necessarily gel well with their day-to-day practices. And then finally, another common challenge here that we find is that auditors still continue to find issues with how privileged access is actually managed. So again, if an organization has invested a fair amount of money into a solution, then how is it then getting to a point where it's not addressing the control points that it actually needs to in order to meet certain audit requirements or industry regulations, or even just general controls. So what is really important? So obviously everybody on the call has said that understanding your current state is probably the most important thing to do as part of your PAM journey, or starting your PAM journey. So the way that we look at doing that is by understanding, in order to understand the size of the problem, is by looking at these three pillars. So the first is the definition. Defining what privileged access is probably one of the most important aspects of the whole journey. It gives everybody within the organization a benchmark in which to understand, okay, what is privileged and what isn't. The second is technical controls. So now these are provided by a PAM solution, but not all technical controls come via a PAM solution. Some are and some aren't. I think the idea here is that you get an understanding of what controls are appropriate, and then subsequently assign or have those capabilities ready to be used when you're going through the process of reviewing your current state. And then finally, process or capability. Now, this is effectively tying the other two pillars together, where you're taking the definition and you're taking the technical controls that you have available to you, and you're implementing that within your organization, and getting an understanding of how that is being deployed and where it is being deployed is also a really important aspect. So these are the kind of three pillars that we work against, and how we go ahead in terms of understanding, again, how the size of that problem looks like. So let me go into a little bit more detail. So what we use in conjunction with those three pillars is effectively this PAM framework. And this PAM framework effectively helps us understand in varying aspects of your privileged access management journey where you could effectively be doing well, and where you may be faltering. But first and foremost, the most important part, and I've mentioned this several times, is the definition of what privileged access is within your organization. Now, the best way to understand where you're at is by going through and understanding roughly where you are in terms of a state of maturity. So let's say, for example, within your organization, you may have no definition of what privileged access is. There's nothing wrong with that. At least you then have an understanding of where you are. The second level in terms of defining maturity would be having a high level definition of what privileged access is. Now, this could effectively be in the context of a framework or an information security policy, something that effectively from a high level describes what constitutes privileged access, or at least at a very high level. The next level would be having a detailed definition of what privileged access is at or for each technology, system, or application that you have within your organization. This takes a little bit of time to do, but again, at least that way you have a very contextual understanding of what privileged access looks like within each and every single technology, system, or application you have within your organization. And then finally, as you go through the process of using a PAM framework similar to this, then you'd go through a process of regularly reviewing what privileged access is, both at a high level and low level. So both at a high level of your general concept of what privileged access is, and then also at the low level with each technology platform or system or application you have within your organization. So a common approach to defining privileged access is to start with writing an information security policy. And to be fair, it's a good place to start. It does provide people with an idea of within the organization what is appropriate, what isn't when it comes to privileged access. You may see common statements like accounts with administrative levels of access would be considered privileged, and so on and so forth. But the aspect with regards to defining privilege, defining an information security policy with around privileged access is that there's an expectation where that by writing this particular policy, you go through and all members of the organization should effectively read this policy and then effectively understand it. It would also help another expectation would be that the policy would help provide guidance to new projects around what policies what policy statements they should be adhering to when it comes to implementations of new systems, databases, applications within the organization. And then finally, we would also have an expectation to say that existing systems, team leads and staff would be able to adopt all of the policy principles and apply these to the existing systems within the organization. However, with an information security policy, and this is just me, that I'm sure there's some people out there who find them interesting, but they're not really the most interesting of reads. So the reality really is that only people who have to do something with privileged access have a tendency to read it. If it's not part of their day-to-day, then they're not necessarily going to be taking time out of their day, time out of their typically busy days in order to read an access management policy or a privileged access management policy. New projects that effectively come along are actually after more detail. People want things to have to be a little bit more simpler, a little bit more clear cut, and policies are typically written at a level where they're general and provide just enough detail to say, okay, these are the things that you should be doing or must be doing, but don't necessarily provide the tools and the controls or the capabilities in order to actually implement it. And new projects aren't necessarily going to take that on and try to develop and implement those types of capabilities as well as their existing scope. And the last thing I would probably say is, unless there's a key audit requirement or a serious issue, operational teams wouldn't necessarily would find it really difficult to try to implement the policy conditions. Now, all of this to say, I'm not saying that the requirement of an information security policy isn't needed. What I'm saying is that it operates at a relatively high level, but it doesn't necessarily get you to a point where you actually really understand what the current state of your privileged access is within an organization. So how would you understand? So the question here is, how would you understand the size of the problem? How would you understand how much privileged access you effectively have? So what we've done is we've come up with a 3-step repeatable process, which we hope will help you understand how many privileged accounts you have within your IT estate, within your system, or even the applications that you're reviewing. So the first step is to look at all of the systems and applications within your IT estate and prioritize them. Now, with this, by having this approach, I appreciate this looks at the question effectively here would be, how would you prioritize? Now, there you could use your most business critical applications or your systems. You could use various industry frameworks that are appropriate to your industry, or you could also use just general best practice, and there are loads of guides out there to help you do so. The second step in this process would be to agree what constitutes privilege at the system or application level. So not necessarily going through a process of doing it at a high level straight away, but going down to the process, going down to the point of saying, for example, for a Windows operating system, what would be constituted as privileged access at that level? If you had an Oracle database, for example, what would be considered privileged access there? And you should do this as with the system owners, the leads, or and their administrators. This will effectively help with the general engagement and start getting people to start actually understanding the importance of privileged access to. And then finally, the third step in this process would be for you to extract a list of accounts from these systems, and using the definition that you've created, mark the accounts that have or are privileged against this new definition. By doing this, you're effectively hitting that third stage of maturity relatively quickly. And in the process of doing so, you're helping elevate the maturity of your definition state, as well as identifying how big that problem is within your organization. So now there's a whole host of benefits off the back of doing a process like this. As I mentioned before, you're engaging with the system owners, the application administrators in this process, and you're actually getting them engaged in the concept of what privileged access is all about, and getting them to start thinking about actually the size of the problem, how best they can control it. Even if it's not necessarily using a PAM solution, there could be inherent controls within these systems that could help reduce the risk and help reduce that overall likelihood or the potential likelihood of these accounts being misused in any which way. The other benefit is that you can start sizing, now you've got an actual view of what the size of your problem looks like. And that could be through understanding what systems provide the capabilities that you require in order to manage these privileged accounts, or if you have already selected and implemented a PAM solution, or how big have you appropriately sized your PAM solution, and if you haven't, then effectively what difference is required. You can then go through the process of actually understanding and defining from a high level what your roadmap will look like, and I'll come on to that in a little bit as to what that should look like. And then you can also start understanding what other controls could be applied. As I mentioned earlier, a benefit of engaging with the system owners and administrators is actually looking at what other controls could be applied to your PAM, to these accounts, outside of your PAM solution. So what I'd like to do is kind of get an idea of where you guys are at in terms of your own PAM maturity journey against the three pillars that the three pillars that I described earlier. So there's effectively 3 points. So instead of coming up with varying, because these could be used in conjunction with varying aspects. So the poll question effectively here is, where are you in your PAM journey? And the first level will effectively say, we have nothing at all. We don't do anything. The second level would be best effort with some high level guidance provided. The third would be, we're good and we're actually getting better. We have low level and high level descriptions of privileged access. We're actually addressing, we have a PAM solution and actually have formal processes, or you're absolutely bossing it. Like you're doing everything from a repeatable process and over there. I'll give you guys some time to answer that question. Okay, really good. So we've got 36% who say that they don't really have anything at the moment. We've got 14% actually saying that they do something in that space, so it's a best effort with some guidance provided. And we've got 50% of the group actually saying we're doing really good within the space and actually even getting better. So that's actually really good. Okay. So now we've got ourselves to a point where we're starting to actually understand the size of the problem itself. We've got some actual quantitative data which helps us understand how many privileged accounts we have across the various systems and applications within your IT estate. Now you can actually start getting to a point where you're starting to build out your PAM journey, your PAM roadmap. And in relation to that, the question then becomes is, well, what order? How do you know where to effectively start? So this all very much depends on where you are in your own journey, which aspects need to be addressed and which don't. So you could start off by working out what your technical requirements are. So working on that second pillar where we talk about technical control. So understanding now against those privileged accounts that you've identified, what technical controls would you like to apply to them, and then what technical capabilities would then help support the implementation of those technical controls. The other aspect is then, if you're already along the lines of having implemented a PAM solution, you could then start writing or uplifting your PAM processes and integrating those with the existing account lifecycle processes themselves. As part of operating, as part of having an understanding of how big your solution is, you can actually now at this point also, depending again on your on where you are in your journey, you could use this to start building out an operating model of how the solution itself should be managed and who should effectively be managing it. You may or may not already have those technical requirements already in place, but let's say, for example, you do. Then at that point, then the next stage or the next step could be where you design your PAM solution, or you uplift your PAM solution with the existing, with the new technical controls or the additional capabilities that are required based on the analysis that you can now build upon with what you've done in those in now understanding the size of your problem. You can then go on to determine an order by which you can onboard these various privileged accounts to a PAM solution. and then also articulate the size of the impact that's associated with changing the way in which, changing the way in which they are managed and controlled, and ensuring that you've got the appropriate change management features surrounding that particular account system and your overall IT estate and privileged access management, privileged access account estate. And then finally, you could also, depending on, again, whether or not you have one or you don't, you could either write or uplift your PAM policy or implement even a framework, which will then help go through that kind of circular process of continual improvement in your PAM journey. Now, it all very much depends on what is required and where you are in your own journey. And this is effectively, hopefully, the points that you can use using the analysis that you've just executed to then build out a more defined roadmap to help you along that journey. So hopefully we provided you guys with some ideas, kind of debunk some kind of myths in terms of how and what privileged access is, giving you guys an idea of what steps you can take in order to improve on your own privileged access management journeys, and giving you an idea of how to lay that out. I'm now basically going to hand back over to John for questions that you guys may have.
Sunit, Sarah, thank you very much for that presentation. Really, really interesting. So, folks, if you've got any questions, if you'd like to submit them via the Q&A button, we have got a few in already, and I'm just trying to get them into some sort of order. I'm going to go with, whenever I talk to bosses, they start with, when is this going to be over? So how long would a typical project take in your view, from nothing to get into that master of maturity, bossing it stage, which I think should be a new status on any maturity model?
I think so too. So the thing with I think one of the things that we have to understand when it comes to privileged access is that it's not just a short-term fix, and this is where a lot of organizations and management typically expect, okay, well, if I'm paying for a solution, I should be able to see results pretty much instantaneously. To kind of answer the question, how long would it take? It's an institutional change process. So that is about embedding the management of privileged access and continuing to improve on it as we get to that point of having a clear definition at the high and even the low level. In my experience, to kind of get to that bottom, from that bottom state right to the top, you'll make some really impressive gains within 1 to 2 years. But really, to get right to that top, I've typically seen that it takes about 4 to 5 years.
Wow.
And then also to, I guess, add to that as well, the IT environment, the IT environment's changing, the threats are changing. So what you thought was a what you thought was a decent roadmap, when you started the journey, you actually need to revisit that roadmap and that strategy every couple of years, or preferably every year. So you might find that in 3 years' time, you actually need a different piece of capability or different piece of technology in order to keep up with those, with the ever evolving threat landscape and the IT changes.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a continuous journey.
Rather than just a project of months, weeks, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. A couple of questions which I think are linked. So what does good really look like in a PAM solution? And similarly, there's a similar question for the actual project. You know, how do you ensure the PAM project is a success?
Okay, so let me tackle what good looks like. So are we talking about, so we're talking here about what good looks like from a PAM solution? Well,
yeah,
there's so many vendors out there that offer a really good, that actually offer a whole host of capabilities. What I would say is ease of implementation. So understanding how understanding and implementing that solution well, that constitutes a good, that's what good looks like. Being able to easily uplift and evolve with your organization and its requirements, as Sarah just quite rightly mentioned. You know, your requirements, your IT solution itself, your IT systems in general, the threat landscapes will effectively evolve over time, and you want to align yourself with a solution that kind of moves with that threat landscape, and also having something that's relatively easy to manage and operate. I know that sounds relatively high level, but I think those 3 points are quite important when it comes to a PAM solution, because what we're trying to do here is make sure that you have the right controls in place, and operating and managing those controls are there to provide that balance between usability versus also providing security as well.
And we see the same with simple, you know, things that we use at home. The successful mobile phone suppliers, they give you a really good interface that's easy to use and gives you the features that arguably you either want or you didn't know you wanted until they were there.
True.
So I'm just conscious of time. I'm going to do, I think, one more question. So legacy always catches you out, and we love shiny new solutions. They come out perfect functionality, but legacy catches us out. So how do you bring those legacy systems that might not integrate with what's inevitably Microsoft Active Directory within an organization now? How do you bring those solutions into the PAM project?
So it's a really good approach, but so kind of relating back to what what I just discussed in terms of the approach when it comes to understanding which accounts need to be controlled. I mentioned one of the points that I mentioned is that there can be controls outside of a PAM solution that can be applied. But let's say, for example, you do want to utilize the controls within a PAM solution. There are ways in which you can utilize them. So vendors are becoming quite aware of, well, vendors are actually quite strongly aware of this, and there are connectors out there for these for some of these legacy systems. And if there isn't a connector available, then custom connectors can be created, and they will help enable some of the key features within these PAM solutions. So effectively, there's a flurry of ways that you can use and help onboard those legacy accounts or legacy privileged accounts.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. I know I said one question, but there is another one. I've just spotted it. We started right at the beginning. We talked about third-party risk. We talked about SolarGate or whatever it was called. Uh-huh. How would you advise managing third parties who are using privileged accounts within your organization?
So I think one of the most the inevitable kind of process that you'll go through when you're looking at these accounts that have privileged access is and utilizing these PAM solutions is that they offer most do offer the kind of capability of granting access to third parties or individuals, and then they can actually record everything that has been done with these particular privileged accounts. What this effectively does by having the actions recorded is it removes the ability for these third parties to actually see the credentials that they're using in order to access your organization's systems. It also, you can then use that to kind of trace back the actions and the activities that that the third party individual has executed on your systems, and effectively this process will also stop by removing the privileges of being able to see the password. You're actually stopping those individuals from sharing those privileged credentials. All in all, holding proof of what individuals or third parties have actually done with those privileges.
And we shouldn't, we shouldn't forget about the kind of more boring or foundational controls as well. So third-party security due diligence is still important here. General identity and access management controls are still important here to make sure that that's incorporated into, the JML or joiner mover leaver process as well. So it's again part of that ecosystem, and not just about the PAM solution or the tool, but all these other things that make up an ecosystem of security, good cybersecurity controls needs to be considered as well.
Yeah, never a truer word spoken. I think with 4-5 minutes maybe overrun, thank you very much everybody for staying with us. Excellent presentation from both, and look forward to seeing people on the next webinar or maybe face-to-face events. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.